Hello and welcome to That Encyclopedia Podcast with your hosts, Will and Jacob.
Hello.
Well, it's good to have you with us again. Today we are talking about... I found this topic interesting, and I'm sure with your background you did as well, as someone who has some experience with designing studies for scientific research, studies into things pertaining to interesting human behaviour and the making of, some might say, extreme decisions. But in this episode we are talking about the Milgram experiment, which was the famous experiment from the 1960s that it's likely you've heard of even if you are not familiar with the name, which was an attempt to understand how obedient people are to authority figures, inspired by... I say inspired by, it's a weird way to phrase it now that I know what I'm going to say next, but essentially inspired by Stanley Milgram's thoughts on the Holocaust and the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a German-Austrian official who had played a role in the Holocaust and was a Nazi war criminal. So Milgram devised an experiment to study the psychology of genocide and answer the contemporary question, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Well, Jacob, what do you think about the Milgram experiment? Or Milgram, I'm not really sure how his name is meant to be emphasised.
I suspect it's Milgram. This is one of the most famous experiments ever conducted in the history of science, full stop, I think, and probably the most famous experiment conducted in the history of the social sciences, and specifically in the realm of social psychology. I think the only one that might come close might be the Stanford prison experiments that had nothing to do with Stanley Milgram, but they were conducted around this time. This post-war period was something of a golden age for social psychology and research into human behavior, particularly in the Ivy League universities in the US, the 50s and 60s. Research conducted at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, all of these big name universities were very interested on understanding how the Second World War in particular could have transpired the way it did, and what sort of human-driven processes led to events unfolding that directly caused a Second World War so soon after the first one, which is an interesting approach to take, because normally when people discuss the causes of the Second World War, they talk about the more sort of formal political factors, and they mention things like the Treaty of Versailles or the economic situation in post-World War I Germany, and those are all very valid, but I think these experiments into human sociology and human psychology are worthy as well, in general. However, some of the experiments, and the Milgram experiment in particular, are extremely questionable ethically, and such an experiment would not be approved by most university ethics boards today, because even though there was no physical danger involved to anyone, there was a degree of emotional and psychological danger to the participant, the unknown sort of subject who's actually the one being tested. I think the most important thing to do is to walk through what this experiment actually involved, the nuts and bolts of it, and then from there we should be able to explain, if it's not obvious, why it might be considered problematic today. And then we could also discuss the results, because the results might surprise you in a clickbaity sort of way. Will, would you like to briefly walk through? If I've just signed up, the article actually has really conveniently a scanned photo of the original public announcement that Milgram and his team put up when they were trying to recruit subjects for this study, and it was a paid study, which means if you participated, you would be compensated. At the time, you were paid $4, which is the equivalent of $36 in 2021, so probably more, about $40 now. So $40, you could suffer the horror of inflicted insight. Not that they would tell you that, but we'll get around to that. So yes, I am one of these people. Let's say I fall into the other category of who's wanted, and you are Stanley Milgram or someone on the research team, and I have just turned up to engage in this experiment. What do I experience? What happens to me?
Okay, so you welcome. First of all, we'll pay you your $4, but we'll wait till the end. Just going to run our little study first. You're going to be taking part in a scientific study of memory and learning. You see, we're interested in the effect of punishment on a subject's ability to memorize. Now, I just want to clarify, although I said you'd get the money at the end, you will get your payment irrespective of the results of the study, so don't allow that to concern you. We just want your honest participation. So as you can see, in this session, we've got yourself, Jacob, but also we've got Bob here as well. He's going to take part in this round. But we need a teacher and we need a learner. So to decide between you, Jacob, and Bob, I'm going to get you to draw slips of paper from this little bag here. So would you like to take a slip from the bag, Jacob?
Of course, yeah, I can do that.
Okay. Now tell me, what does your slip say? It says teacher, doesn't it? There it is. There it says teacher.
It does say teacher. It does say teacher. I thought maybe could it say learner, but no, it would always say teacher. This is a rigged slip.
Your one definitely says teacher. And Bob, what does yours say? Bob quickly pockets his slip of paper. Oh yeah, it said learner. Yeah. So there you are.
Absolutely, definitely. Don't need to read that.
Yep.
To check.
So now we'll just take you through to the other room. So Bob the learner, he's going to be strapped into this chair here. He's going to have his hands bound to the chair, to the arms, and I would like you to note that we're just going to make sure that the learner doesn't escape his obligation here. So we're just going to pop him down in this chair.
He can't leave the chair without your help, can he? He's stuck in this chair.
I've strapped Bob in, but Bob, he's happy. He's going to get $4. He's fine. He's going to learn. We're going to do some science.
So what's this wire that connects Bob to my table?
Oh yes, that wire. Yes, no, that's the conditioning wire. That's going to help Bob learn. Basically, what I would like you to do. Well, we're going to put up a screen. You'll be separated from Bob. You won't be talking to Bob in this activity. Well, you will be communicating with Bob. You will not be. You'll not be able to see Bob. Bob is going to be behind here, and you are going to be behind here. This button here, and this little device here. What I'd like you to do is get Bob to read a list of word pairs, and then you will give him some prompts, and you'll see if he gets the right answer, if he gets the right other part of the word pair. And now if Bob is wrong, what I'd like you to do is press this button, and it will deliver a small electric shock to Bob. So when he gets a wrong answer, I'd like you to press the button. And if he gets a wrong answer, if he gets the correct answer, just move on. If he gets the wrong answer, press the button. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's how we'll start. Okay, we'll start that,
sure.
and that'll be fine. And you'll hear, oh, Bob's got it wrong. You shock him.
Yep.
He's like, ow, that wasn't very fun. But I just like Jacob. Now he's got that one wrong. Can I ask you to turn up the dial on the voltage there on your little buzzer? And we'll
sure. I mean, I'm not an electrician, right? I'm sure these are all safe numbers.
Well, yes. Well, the shock generator itself does say, you can see on the generator it says slight shock on the one side, and danger, severe shock on the other side. But as I've instructed you, I'd like you to turn up the voltage each time.
I see. All the way to the max.
Please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is
because
absolutely
I'm just noticing
essential that you continue.
Okay. What if we fast forward 10 minutes later or whatever?
Okay.
I have, at your in instruction, I have turned it all the way up to severe danger, severe shock. But Bob seems to have stopped responding. Is he okay? Or how should we Do I?
Although the shocks may be painful, there's no permanent tissue damage. So please go on.
I see.
Whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly. Please go on. You have no other choice. You must go on. And that's essentially the experiment, isn't it?
That is the experiment. And when you were in the room, very, very well done, by the way. I felt immersed.
Thank you.
In the experience. I have suffered, actually. Inflicted insight. Very engaging. So the context of the experiment would have made it very clear that the learner, so-called learner, who was, of course, a paid actor in no physical danger, hence why he was separate from the actual subject of the experiment, so they couldn't see him acting, would make it very obvious that they were in extreme pain and then had fallen unconscious or possibly died at the highest voltage levels. It says that the volts ranged from 15 to 450. As the shocks were not actually inflicted, I assume that these numbers were visible to the teacher as well, and the accompanying labels, slight shock to danger, severe shock, were to assist for those subjects or participants, I think we would say now, but I think subject at the time, who were not aware of the danger posed from a 450 volt shock to the human body. The results of the experiment were quite surprising to Stanley Milgram and the team, because the majority of people were, I'm not going to say happy, but ultimately of their own volition, prompted verbally, but nothing more, by the experimenter, to deliver a lethal shock, sometimes multiple times, to the actor sitting behind the screen. And this result seemed to suggest that obedience to authority is reasonably straightforward for people to undertake, even if it obviously results in the endangerment, physical harm, or even death of another human. Now, that said, the majority of the research participants did express various levels of discomfort, and once the shocks reached high levels and the actor started pretending to be in pain, I think more or less all of the subjects declared that they wished to either stop initially or questioned whether they should continue, and sought guidance from the authority figure, the teacher in the lab coat. So the conclusion was not that everyone is secretly a sadistic individual who is just waiting for an excuse to inflict pain on another person. For that sort of conclusion, you'd have to look at the Stanford prison experiment, which has its own problems with it. The conclusion was rather that it's reasonably straightforward to compel people to inflict harm on others if they are urged in an appropriate setting by an authority figure. And you can see straight away the relevance of this to the Nazi regime, or at least that was the idea behind the experiment. However, there are a few problems with this, I would say. The most obvious one, would you agree, Will, is the ethics behind conducting this experiment, because there is a concept called inflicted insight, which is essentially at the risk of psychological harm to a research participant, of gaining insight into themselves that suggests to them that they are a bad person, a horrible person. If you walk out of the experiment having somehow been persuaded or led, or even worse, of your own free will, having done something that has made you question your own morality and your own actions, it can lead to very real psychological trauma and emotional harm. And this was really just not accounted for by the experimenters at all. The article does say that in Milgram's defense, 84% of former participants surveyed later said they were glad or very glad to have participated, with 15% choosing neutral responses. But that only totals 99%, and the response rate was only 92%, which means you've got over 8% of people not indicating that response, which doesn't sound like a lot, but really in a social science setting, it should be an easy 100%, at least being neutral. I mean, people don't always leave an experiment feeling elated and over the moon, because most social science experiments that involve human participants, especially in psychology, to be honest, are reasonably boring and straightforward. You're just doing like puzzles or memory tests and that sort of thing, with no electric shocks involved. So it's not like you need everyone to be feeling ecstatic when they leave the room. But if a single person feels traumatized from your experiment, you've got a serious problem on your hands, and you will be dragged in front of an ethics committee, and there could be very serious consequences for you. But that's today, and that was 80 years ago. So what do you think?
Bob was feeling electric when he left the room. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
How long have you been sitting on that?
Only a few
that's
seconds.
Fine. Okay.
Other problems. I mean, yeah, I think it's hard to say that other problems are more significant or more important than an ethical problem with a study. But I would also imagine that to most listeners, by default, I would expect that it's fairly easy to acknowledge and accept that there are ethical problems with the experiment. I think where we might find more debate or lack of clarity is in what the findings of the study actually mean. Is the study valid? Is the study applicable to the context that we want it to be? And maybe from your own background or knowledge, is doing research like this particularly difficult, and how do you overcome the difficulties? So maybe if we start on what are the results, and what do they actually tell us given what we know about the method?
So I'll just, I think the most succinct way is I'll just read the first paragraph of the results section just to give everyone an overview. So in terms of the actual figures and data of the original experiment, subjects were uncomfortable administering the shocks and displayed varying degrees of tension and stress. Signs included sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, digging their fingernails into their skin. Some fell into nervous laughing fits, and apparently at least one person had some sort of seizure. 14 of the 40 original subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughing or smiling. Every participant paused the experiment at least once to question it. Most continued after being reassured by the experimenter. Some said they would refund the money that they were paid for participating. Although a while after the experiment, Milgram found that many participants, it says the one I read before, 84% of 92% responders said that they were happy or very happy to have taken part in the experiment. And this made such a big impact in the social science scene that variations of this experiment were repeated in many different countries around the world, because what's often forgotten about Stanley Milgram's original experiment is that this wasn't just generic obedience to authority, but there was sort of almost a racist or ethnic sort of component to it, and that Milgram was interested in finding out if there was something about the German psyche and the German culture that meant German people were more obedient to authority than non-German people. So that was actually what he was particularly interested in. And as in pursuit of this goal, the experiment was replicated by different research teams in different research environments, but more or less in the same way around the world, and the results were more or less the same. So a meta-analysis of these studies have shown them to be generally consistent. There's not any kind of methodological issue, as best I can tell. So the actual results are, I mean, obviously they're not unquestionable or anything. Like, you can always question results if you've got new data, but they're generally accepted. There's no massive flaw in how it was set up. The results seem to be valid and they hold up. So it's really just whether they should have been achieved in this way, I think, that is interesting to me. But what are your thoughts?
Well, just to reiterate, in Milgram's version of the experiment, every participant went up to 300 volts. So that's 2/3 of the way to the maximum, and 65% of participants hit the full 450 volts, which was the danger severe shock zone with all the actors expressed pain. So I guess my issue is in terms of language on the concept of validity and applicability. I'm not entirely sold on what this experiment actually shows in terms of how you take the findings of this and extrapolate some meaning and apply it to the wider world, and in particular how you would then apply it to the Holocaust. So what do I mean by this? Well, there's a few quotes here, so I'll just give you I'll give you my own, actually. I'll start with this. Actually, no, there is a good one here. So in this experiment, when comparing this to the Holocaust, the subjects were assured in advance that no permanent physical harm would result from their actions. Now that is almost like in a direct contradiction to the Holocaust, and in, for example, the people that were running death camps. I think it would be unfair to say that, similar to those Milgram experiment subjects, the people who were running death camps and executing executions were probably aware that they were causing permanent physical damage to their victims. But the other thing I find interesting is this concept of authority and comparing the role of the experimenter in the Milgram experiment to the concept of authority figures outside of this experiment setting. So, and what I mean by that is all the people in this experiment and in the other versions, except there were a couple that tried to have a slightly different vibe, I guess. But generally speaking, people were participating in this willingly, understanding it to be scientific research, and as I said, understanding there to be no permanent physical harm to anyone through conducting and taking part in this study. And one might say critically of extrapolating from the Milgram experiment that it shows that yes, participants trust experimenters in scientific studies, but then even in these studies, you could argue they were correct and acting morally in their assessment to do so, because they did not actually cause permanent physical harm to anyone. Although they were conflicted and weren't sure if they were, they actually did not cause permanent physical harm to anyone. And you could argue, oh, they thought that they were, because how would they know if it was an actor or not an actor? I would say that doesn't matter if they know if it's an actor or if it's not an actor, because it was their understanding that they weren't going to cause permanent physical harm because of their trust in the authority figure, and in fact they were right in that assessment. So I just wonder what you think about that take.
Yeah, so I think your point about comparing it to the Holocaust, which was another specific objective of Stanley Milgram's original experiment, is well made, and I agree with it. I think it's not, you can't extrapolate the results of an experiment like this and therefore conclude. I mean, what would you even conclude? That like death camp Nazi guards were just sort of like not aware of anything going on? I think that's a ridiculous conclusion. So I agree with you completely there. I think it's the conclusions are more. You have to apply them to situations which are similar to the experimental setup. I think the second point about kind of debating the sort of moral judgment of the research participants is a really interesting one, kind of philosophically, but I think ultimately it would be, I find it difficult to, I think arguing that because no one was actually harmed kind of vindicates their assessment. I think the idea behind it is more that all of them questioned what they had been assured in the beginning, and almost all of them ultimately decided to continue to the end of the experiment because they had faith and because they trusted the words of an authority figure, despite what was to them believed to be the direct evidence to their ears in front of them.
I feel like the issue with something like this and something this complicated, though, is that presuming why. Like, we can see what people in this situation do, but do we know why they do it? Do we know with confidence that they continue to electrocute or think that they're electrocuting the subject because they trust the researcher? Do they feel like they have some sort of obligation? Maybe they feel like they owe the researcher. Maybe they feel like something bad might happen if they don't continue. And even outside of what they know and what they're thinking, what about the influences of the environment and the interactions that are subconscious, that they do not know are going on? I think it's quite difficult to really know from what we're seeing what the mechanism behind the outcome is, and because the mechanism is hard to know, it's hard to try and apply it elsewhere.
And you have highlighted the fundamental difficulty in conducting social psychology experiments. Correct.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad to hear.
This is a massive. It's not a problem because it's just how the world is, right? The world is a big, complicated place, and if it were,
you can call the world a problem.
This is almost what this is almost what makes it a social science as opposed to a natural science. Really, is this. There's an art to being able to interpret results and justify your results, and a single experiment is really not enough. So you do need to replicate it, and you do need, ideally, to conduct experiments in different ways to achieve a similar result. So I think essentially that your critique is valid, but it's not enough to sort of to invalidate it either. It's just hang on now, we can't say this is definitively the truth with a capital T, and I agree with you there. Like it's not as straightforward as it sometimes is presented in things like documentaries and replications of the experiments under Darren Brown and that sort of thing.
No, I'm happy after reading about it. I'm happy with the research design having a fairly agreeable, like an outcome that, yes, we can sort of trust that this is the outcome of this research design, but the specifics of the research design are such that they are not particularly similar to real world scenarios in ways that you can be confident of. For example, as I said, the dynamic between a person and a research institution and the presumed sort of moral good that a research institution does for society.
And I think with that, we are out of time, more or less. So I would just like to end by saying, as a fun fact, that Stanley Milgram is famous for a second social science idea that you probably have heard of, even if you haven't heard of the Milgram experiment. If you have ever heard of the concept of 6 degrees of separation, that is also from Stanley Milgram, who, after his time at Yale, moved to Harvard University and conducted what he called the Small World Experiment, which is not ethically questionable at all, and simply involved sending a package by post from one end of the country to the other, the only rule being that you had to send it via a person who you personally knew and thought might know someone at the end destination. And the average number of steps it had to be sent on was 6, and that was extrapolated and repeated, and from that eventually grew the simplified but surprisingly accurate concept of 6 degrees of separation. So there you go.
Interesting. Well, be sure to read all about these topics and more on Wikipedia. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Until then.